I am the president of Elderworks Educational Services. We are a not-for-profit 501c3, and I'm assuming that most of the attendees know who we are. We are going to be recording this event and putting it online so people can come back to this and hear Mr. Kenneally again. So I'm going to go ahead and let him talk. All right.
Thank you, Jennifer.
You're welcome.
Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and mute.
Okay. Well, my name is Patrick Kenneally. I'm the McHenry County State's Attorney, and I'm very eager to give a talk on this because it's certainly been something that we've been considering here at the State's Attorney's Office for the past several months, because a lot of what's happened with COVID and the executive orders and some of the things that needed to be done has dramatically impacted not only the state, but also how we do business here at the McHenry County Courthouse. So I'm just going to give a little bit of history and then talk about the executive orders, how those orders are enforced, and some of the lawsuits that have arisen from the executive orders, and some of the constitutional issues as well as the statutory issues that has come up as a result of the executive orders, especially those lawsuits and issues that have really been bubbling to the surface more recently, which has really sort of brought about a national discussion and has informed that national discussion about whether or not it's been prudent to shut down, how do we balance safety versus constitutional rights, things like that. So it's really a fascinating subject, and so I'm very grateful that I was asked to come and give this talk. So the story begins, as everybody knows, in Wuhan, China, in November of 2020, and it's at that time that the COVID virus was discovered. COVID-19 stands for coronavirus disease number 19, and it comes from a large family of coronaviruses. Many of them we know are responsible for things such as SARS and MERS, and that they're all part of the same family. And the reason that it's called corona is Latin for crown, and if you look at some of the protrudences from the virus itself, as you can see in the picture on the right-hand side, many people think that that resembles a crown. So it's unclear exactly how corona evolved. Many people believe that it evolved from bats and jumped to humans from bats at a wet market in China. They think it probably jumped in a non-pathogenic stage, and then it began sort of swapping genes with the SARS virus, which made it much more virulent and allowed it to attack cells more. So how viruses generally work is they take over the DNA machinery of a cell, they replicate themselves, then they kill the cell and are released, and more go out into the body, and the cycle repeats itself until the immune system essentially shuts it down. So let me see if I can get this graphic to play, but this shows the spread of COVID throughout the world by date. So let's see. Are you guys seeing that, the globe?
We see the web link. We don't see the globe.
Oh, hold on. Does that change?
Nope.
Okay, well, that's too bad. That's okay. So anyway, what this link generally shows is, I can see it on my computer, but of course you guys can't see it. But what this essentially shows is just how quickly COVID spread throughout. It started in China, and just how quickly it spread throughout the globe. It's a good graphic, and if you guys want to come back and maybe copy and paste this, I would encourage anybody to check it out. So when we're thinking about COVID, there's been a number of questions, and like, how virulent is it? Is it worse than the flu? Is it better than the flu? Does it spread faster than the flu? Does it kill more people? And generally, a lot of this debate comes down to, from what I learned from the health department, and this is ultimately going to bear on some of the legal issues, so just bear with me. But it comes down to a thing called R0. So the R0 value of COVID is between 2 and 2.5. And essentially what that means is that, all things being equal, somebody that has COVID-19 on average will spread it to 2 to 2.5 other people. Whereas the flu has an R0 value of between 1.4 and 1.6. So you know that COVID is much more virulent. It's much more likely to be spread than something like the flu. And then the question is, okay, well, how deadly is COVID? How many people ultimately die as a result of contracting this? And the answer is it really depends. Older people, especially people that are 70 plus, have a much higher risk of actually dying when they get COVID. But if you look at some of the official numbers, if you look at just the CDC numbers in terms of total deaths versus total confirmed cases, you would have a death rate of about 5%. But most experts don't think that 5% of people who contract COVID are actually killed by the disease. Rather, they think that we're significantly underestimating the number of people that have actually contracted COVID, because many people who have COVID haven't been tested. So there was a recent Stanford study by a professor, John Ioannidis, and what he did is he looked at all of the antibody tests. And the antibody tests are those tests where they go out and sample just sort of a random group of the population, and they check to see if they have the antibodies for COVID, which gives which gives a more accurate estimation of how many people have actually contracted the disease. And what he estimates is that people over 70, so what he estimated is that for the entire population, the death rate is between about 0.85%, so close to 1%. But he also says that within that statistical range of error, it could be as low as 0.02% of people that contract COVID actually die. For those under 70, so for those people who contract COVID who are under the age of 70 years old, he estimates that the death rate is between 0 and 0.26%, which even at 0.26%, so at the highest it could be, it's about twice as deadly as the flu, which is about 0.1%. But before we go saying that COVID is a hoax or underplaying the real and actual danger that it presents, let's take a look at this slide. So these are all the deaths in the state of Illinois by week starting in January of 2017. And that orange line is sort of the algorithm or sort of based on history, what we can expect the death rate to be. So anything above the orange line is considered by epidemiologists to be excess deaths. So if you look, the deaths in Illinois have generally stayed below that line until you get to April of 20. And what happened in April of 20? Well, COVID went wild in the state of Illinois and throughout the United States, causing an increase in deaths of anywhere between 500 to 1,000 people every single week. So this is a very real threat that is endangering people's lives and leading to excess mortality in the state of Illinois when compared with prior incidents of deaths. So I remember, so this presenter remembers when the whole sort of corona hysteria started. And for me, it was March 12th of 2020. And that was the day that Trump gave his national address. And I remember a lot of people had heard of the disease, and Trump and many other politicians had been underplaying the threat of the disease. And a lot of people didn't really know. We seem to be sort of at an inflection point on March 12th of 2020 in terms of, is this something that's going to be contained, or is this likely to spread? And what do we really think about this? So many, such as myself, tuned in eagerly to hear the president's speech, which, in fairness, and I'm not a rabid anti-Trumper, but in fairness, it probably wasn't his best performance. I think that, there was an incident where he was sort of twiddling his thumbs, and a lot of people thought that his speech was a little bit uneven. But for many, this was really the first time that they were forced to acknowledge and to grapple with the enormity of the scope as well as the threat that was faced. And so as he kind of gave his disordered speech, across the screen as he was talking was Tom Hanks and his wife are in Australia, and they've been quarantined because they had coronavirus. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, oh my God, this feels like a death sentence. And if they can't protect Tom Hanks, who's America's sweetheart, what hopes do the rest of us have? And so after that press conference, President Trump began giving daily press conferences, and other governors soon got in on the act. And Governor Pritzker got in on the act too. And I don't know if anybody has been watching his daily press conferences, which he scuttled about 3 weeks ago as soon as he announced the reopening phases. But if you were watching, one of the things that he continued to say, one of his common refrains was, we're just looking towards the science. We're always just looking towards the science, and the science is telling us what we need to do and how we need to do it. So apparently Governor Pritzker was bringing his offering to the science oracle, and the science oracle was pumping out public policy and imparting that upon the governor. But I think one of the criticisms that the governor has faced, especially when he continues just to say, oh, this is what the science is telling us, is that science doesn't answer moral questions. Science doesn't answer public policy questions. Science doesn't answer things like what should we do with information, what ought we do. Rather, science answers empirical questions like what, how much, how long, that informs those public policy decisions. And if you look at many of the modeling that's been done, especially over the last months, I mean, it's been drastically different with enormous ranges of statistical error in terms of the hospital beds that are needed, in terms of the number of cases, in terms of the death that we expected. You never really get specific numbers from the Illinois Department of Public Health. So even at the press conferences, they show us the graphs, but there's no numbers associated with those graphs. And if you look at what Professor Nigel Goldenfield said, he actually spoke at one of the press conferences as the governor was announcing that he was going to be extending the stay-at-home and the business closure order in late April. And what he said is fueling an epidemic is rather like modeling the trajectory of a rocket. When you don't know where it started, what direction it was pointing, and how much fuel is aboard the rocket. Modeling an epidemic is not rocket science. And so the whole idea that, well, science is giving us all these answers, but then you have the epidemiologists who are responsible for pumping out the science saying, essentially, we don't really know how this is going to affect the state. We don't know how many people are going to catch COVID, and we don't know where this whole thing is going to land. It kind of undermines that. And I think has led to a lot of fair criticism about whether or not the stay-at-home order and the business closure order were overwrought. And it also leads to other criticism of maybe we should have done more just simply to err on the side of caution. So this is sort of what the governor's position has been when it comes to people who have critiqued the stay-at-home order as well as the business closure order. What he essentially says is that we're not going to sacrifice human life for money, all right? So, and I think if you read this, and we can go through it. Finally, there has been some talk over the last 24 hours by some about who this nation might be willing to sacrifice to COVID-19 for the sake of our economic interests. Well, in case there's any doubt in your minds, I'm not willing to sacrifice anyone. There's no life in this state that is more or less precious than any other. No person more or less worthy of saving. I want grandparents around to help raise their grandchildren. I want people to spend years after this celebrating birthdays and weddings, anniversaries, and healthy retirements. I want Illinois to continue to be enriched by its young and old residents alike. Our economic strength comes from our diversity in the state and hard-won experience of our citizens. Without that, we are nothing. With it, there is nothing that we can do. And I think that that's well said, and I think that that's a fair point, but I also think that there's sort of a false dichotomy here, which is it's just simply lives that we need to save versus COVID versus money, all right? And I can tell you by being a public official involved in law enforcement in McHenry County, that as a result of the shutdown order, as a result of human isolation, there's been a number of direct people, and we're still sort of waiting for the numbers to come in, and a lot of the data is premature, but there's been a number of people that have died. So we've seen, especially in the Chicagoland area, not so much in McHenry County, but in the Chicagoland area, suicides have skyrocketed, all right? Drug overdose deaths have skyrocketed, and all of these deaths of despair, which really we all became aware of in 2008, as suicides began to go up, as drug overdoses began to go up, as deaths from things like liver failure and diabetes, from people overeating or consuming too much alcohol, all of those deaths of despair as a result of the isolation that many people have faced have continued to grow up. So it's not necessarily lives saved through these prophylactic measures for COVID versus money or paychecks or people getting rich. It is lives for lives. We should also be conscious of the fact that any time that there's a downturn in the global economy, they have algorithms that can actually calculate and estimate the number of people that have died. And that's especially true in third world countries. So every single time somebody doesn't get $1 here in the United States, that's one less dollar that can be sent to the Red Cross to help in third world and impoverished countries to provide medical care to somebody or to provide food. It's one less dollar that can be invested in the developed world. And there's been a lot of people in the United Nations that have criticized the United States for the shutdown because of the devastating impact that it's having in third world countries and can be expected to have in third world countries for years, if not decades to come, depending on how long it takes to dig out of the recession that we're in. Okay, so let's get to the actual legal stuff. And see how what we know about COVID, where it started, what type of impact that it's had has on some of the legal decisions that are being made. So many people may be curious when they think about, well, why is the governor issuing executive orders? By what right, by what authority does the governor have to issue these executive orders, which are essentially legislative in terms of their nature by virtue of the fact that they're telling people what they can and can't do? Rather, isn't that the job of the legislature? And that's true. It is the job of the legislature to legislate, but it is, but a governor can take on legislative type activities provided he's been empowered to do so by the legislature. And that's kind of the whole administrative code. So the governor runs all of these administrative bodies, such as the Illinois Department of Public Health, who can make rules which seem to be legislative in nature, but they've been authorized to do so because of their expertise by the legislature. After all, the legislature doesn't want to dig into the weeds when it comes to making and divining the types of very specific regulations that are necessary to keep people safe. Rather, that's the job for the experts. So the Illinois legislature has empowered the governor to issue these executive orders, and he's doing it under the auspices of the Illinois Emergency Management Act. All right. But before the governor can issue these executive orders, he first needs to declare what's called a disaster. All right. So he did that back on March 9th of 2019. And this is what a disaster is defined as under the Illinois Emergency Management Act. All right. A disaster means an occurrence or threat of widespread or severe damage, injury, loss of life or property resulting from any natural or technological cause, including, but not limited to, and then it goes on, a fire, earthquake. The ones that are critical for what we're doing here is epidemic, as well as public health emergency. So I think that COVID, which is a pandemic, as well as an epidemic. Epidemic just means a outbreak of a disease. A pandemic sort of means a global or a large area outbreak of a disease. He's probably on safe grounds in terms of the fact that he has issued a disaster. All right. So after the governor issues a disaster, what powers can he thereafter derive? All right. So let's just go through this law. This is the Illinois Emergency Management Act. And it says, in the event of a disaster, the governor may, by proclamation, declare that a disaster exists. And upon such period not to exceed 30 days, the governor shall have and may exercise for a period not to exceed 30 days the following emergency powers. So the first thing to note is that this disaster declaration cannot exceed 30 days. All right, which begs the legal question: can the governor just after the 30 days is up, can he then just declare another disaster? So that's one of the legal questions that we're going to talk about. But also look at, what does the governor need to establish in order to declare that a disaster exists? Are there any benchmarks? Are there any metrics? Does he have to establish that this many lives are in danger? Does he have to establish that this much property has been destroyed or is at risk? Does he have to demonstrate that the river has flooded to excess amount and it's endangering this many houses? And the answer is no. All right. So the governor has unilateral discretion, complete an unabridged discretion to determine whether or not a disaster exists, and nobody really can do anything about it. So the only thing that limits the governor from declaring whether or not a disaster exists and then taking on the mantle of these disaster powers is his own discretion and his own goodwill. And so then let's look at, after he declares a disaster, what can he do? And this is what they've pointed to justify the stay-at-home order. This is what they've pointed to in order to justify the business closure order. And the thing I'd like to direct your attention to subsection 7.8. So that's the second bullet point. And it says that the governor, after declaring a disaster, can control the ingress as well as the egress to and from a disaster area, the movement of persons within that area, and the occupancy of premises therein. All right, think about that for a second. The governor has declared a disaster, and it's not just a disaster of McHenry County or the homes along the river or the village where the tornado went through. He's declared a disaster for the entire state of Illinois. And by virtue of the fact that he's declared a disaster for the entire state of Illinois, now he can, quote, control the movements of persons within the area. Think about that. Think about the breadth of what that power means. Let's say the governor wanted to put a group of people in an internment camp. Now, I'm not suggesting that this governor is going to do anything like that, but the point is he has these remarkable and awesome powers under the disaster declaration that can essentially that are readily abused, I guess would be my point. Now look at subsection 7.12, all right? He can control and restrict and regulate by rationing, freezing, use of quotas. But look at the catch-all phrase, which is in bold. In addition, he can perform and exercise any other function, powers, and duties as may be necessary to promote and secure the safety and protection of the civilian population. In other words, the governor, after declaring a disaster, can do anything that he deems necessary to promote and secure the safety and the protection of the civilian population. It's hard to understand what a limiting principle would be. It's hard to understand that when the governor has declared a disaster, what he can't do, what he can't do while that disaster proclamation has been issued. Can he dissolve the legislature? Can he dissolve the courts? Can he do any number of things that could result in an abuse of power or the tyrannical exercise of power? And I don't want you to think that I have my tinfoil hat on and I'm thinking that Governor Pritzker is going to turn Illinois into communist Russia. But the point is that we should be interpreting our laws to protect our constitutional and our Republican form of government. And if you're going to interpret the laws to allow the governor, based on his own discretion, to continue to declare a disaster proclamation every 30 days based on nothing other than his own discretion, and then you're going to imbue him with these incredible powers, it would seem maybe that you might want to think about how you want to interpret this statute, maybe to limit those powers. But we'll get to that. All right. So March timeline, March 9th, 2020, the governor declares the entire state of Illinois to be a disaster. As we talked about, now at the time, there were only 11 cases of COVID. So the governor justified declaring a disaster when there were only 11 cases of COVID, all of which were in Chicago. Now, let's say that you're in Clay County, 400 miles south. There's not a single person within your count. There's not a single person within 400 miles of you that has COVID-19, and yet your county is declared a disaster area. There was a lot of people in downstate Illinois that weren't too happy about that. March 13th, the governor issues E08, and essentially what that did is it banned all public and private gatherings of more than 1,000 people. So all the concerts, all the big events for the summer got shut down. E03 on March 13th of 2020, that closed the schools. E05, that closed a lot of the restaurants. And then on March 20th of 2020, the governor issued the infamous E08, which is and when I say E08, I mean Executive Order, and that is the infamous stay-at-home and business closure order. So the only thing that was allowed to stay open was essential businesses. And essential businesses are healthcare and public health operations such as hospital, human service operations such as your psychologist, as well as DCFS, essential infrastructure that includes the food production, distribution and sale, construction, all of the things that are necessary for the infrastructure and for things to get where they need to go. Essential government functions that includes the police, emergency personnel, law enforcement, as well as yours truly. Stores that sell groceries and medicine, liquor stores and cannabis dispensaries. All right, so liquor stores and cannabis dispensaries were deemed to be essential. Food, beverage, and cannabis production and agriculture also essential. Charitable and social service organizations, which is good. Many of the things that help, especially the most vulnerable among us, were allowed to stay open. The media was allowed to stay open. Gas stations, financial institutions, and the mail, critical trades, plumbers, professional services. So if you have a law firm, all right, then you were allowed to stay open. So so if you have a law firm or if you're an accountant or all the rest of it, you're allowed to stay open. If you sell groceries, even if you're Target and Walmart, and you also are selling other stuff like electronics, or you're selling toys for kids, or you're selling hardware, things of that nature, as long as part of what you're selling is food, you're allowed to stay open. And that led a lot of people to say, like, hey, wait a minute. Why is Target being allowed to stay open and they're continuing to be allowed to sell garden products and electronics, but the mom and pop retail store who owns the franchise Radio Shack, we need to close down? It seems as though we're, to a certain extent, economically picking winners and losers. So that's one of the things that would ultimately come into play when some of the legislation begins to be filed and the governor has to defend these things. So then you could also not leave your home, okay? So think about that. Again, you could not leave your home except for certain things that were set forth by the governor. And again, this is the governor's own discretion. He doesn't need to listen to anybody else. He doesn't need our representatives to weigh in on this. Based on what the governor deems to be proper, no metrics need to be satisfied. He can determine what we can and cannot leave our homes for. That, again, just goes to underscore really the power that he has when he's declared a disaster. We can leave our homes for health and safety if we need to go to the hospital or something like that, for necessary supplies and services, all right? And then he defines what are necessary supplies and services, which a lot of times are simply just groceries and food and other consumer products. We can leave for outdoor activity, we can leave for essential businesses, and we can leave to provide care for family as well as friends. But we can't leave the home to go to church, all right? We can't leave our home to go and just visit and spend time with family. We can't leave our home to go and peacefully protest and petition our government. We can't leave our home to go and gather at a friend's home for poker or wedding. We can't leave our home for a birthday party or for a graduation party. And a lot of people criticize the governor as like, look, this order is just so ruthlessly utilitarian. I mean, this is just, we can only go and do those things necessary for survival and inhuman, because the whole reason why we're going to the food store, the whole reason why we're going to work, the whole reason why we have all of this infrastructure is so we can enjoy many of the things that are now banned under E08, like visiting with family, like going to a graduation party, things of that nature, like going on vacation. And then these are the social distancing requirements that were also built into E08. You must maintain at least 6 foot social distancing from other individuals, washing hands with soap. So these are all part of the things that the governor is telling us that we have to do, really regulating our behavior down to whether or not we wash our hands or not. So let's go to April. So this is what happens in April. E016, the governor extends all prior executive orders until April 30th. That was expected. He issued E08 very at the very tail end of March. He wants to extend that for another 30 days. So he does that until April 30th. All right, now on April 23rd of 2020, Representative Bailey, who's kind of got this flat top haircut, he's a representative congressman from down in Clay County, he sues Governor Pritzker saying the executive orders are illegal. And we're going to talk about why. And that gets filed in Clay County. That same day, the governor bars any residential and non-residential evictions, which makes sense. There's a lot of people that are out of work by virtue of the executive orders, and it wouldn't be fair to kick them out of their homes, especially if they can't pay their mortgages as well as their rents. And then on April 30th of 2020, the governor issues E08 and it's basically just a new stay-at-home order, and it very slightly loosens some of the restrictions from Executive Order number 8. All right. And how it does that is it allows for people to go to state parks. It allows for people to go boating in no more than 2. And in one of the briefs, they sort of pointed out that a family of 7 can get in their car and drive to the marina, but only 2 of them can get on the boat. And so there's some of these absurdities that begin to abound when you're talking about executing and putting this executive order into practice. It also allows for greenhouses and nurseries and garden centers to open up, and it allows for golf courses to open up as well. And then non-essential retail. So the Kohl's, if you order something online, you can then go to the Kohl's. You don't have to do it by mail. You can go to the Kohl's and pick up your new jacket or blouse or whatever the case may be. And then in addition, it required everybody where you can't social distance at 6 feet or more. It required all those people to wear face masks, which really isn't that controversial. Now, on April 29th of 2020, the Supreme Court suspends speedy trial rights. And for those of you who aren't lawyers, a speedy trial means that the government, my office, has to bring you to trial within 120 days if you're in custody, or within 160 days if you're out of custody, should you demand a speedy trial. And the idea is that if we're going to charge somebody with a crime who has not been proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt and is still presumed innocent, especially if that person is unable to post bond, they have to be sitting in jail. And if they want to get to their trial and show that they're innocent, or show that the state can't prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, they can file a speedy trial demand and ensure that we bring them to trial within 3 months. Well, now what the Supreme Court did is it said we're suspending the speedy trial requirement, which is a constitutional protection. All right. We're suspending the speedy trial requirement. And by virtue of the fact that there's COVID, people who may be in custody, who can't pay bond, despite the fact that they're presumed innocent, you got to remain there, and there's going to be these added delays to your liberty. So that was something that certainly caused quite a stir among the defense community here, and for the state's attorney's office, whose job is to get justice, whose job is to abide by and protect the constitutional rights of defendants. I know that there were a lot of people that found these types of provisions problematic. April 30th of 2020, the Beloved Church sues Governor Pritzker, and what they say is that the executive order is violating their free exercise of religion protected under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. So now we get to May, and a lot of stuff starts happening. So there's more lawsuits. Elim Romanian Pentecostal Church and Logos Ministry in Niles sue Governor Pritzker. May 11th, Poopy's Bar, I didn't name the place, and Grill and Visible Changes Hair Salon also pile on, and they sue Governor Pritzker. Senator Cabello jumps in, and they file suit against Governor Pritzker. Kenneally, yours truly, files an amicus brief in Senator Cabello's case, questioning the legality of the executive order, and in terms of on a statutory basis, but also on a constitutional basis. On May 18th, now there's a number of businesses that are saying, you know what? To Hades with the executive order. I'm a restaurant. I'm losing business. I only have 3 weeks left before I have to shut down. I'm going to open. And the governor was faced with this growing chorus of businesses that was saying, Governor, we're no longer going to comply with your executive order. And so what the governor did is he had the Illinois Department of Public Health issue a rule that would make it a Class A misdemeanor for a business to open. Now, the maximum penalty for a Class A misdemeanor is 365 days in jail. So essentially, you're a restaurant. This is your livelihood. You've been shut down for over 2 months, and you feel as though in order to survive, you have to open back up. Well, now the governor is saying you do that, you could face 365 days in jail. Needless to say, this was an incredibly controversial rule that got a lot of pushback, and on May 29th of 2020, the IDPH repealed the rule. On May 21st of 2020, so on May 21st, that was the day that when we talked about in April, Representative Bailey sues Governor Pritzker, saying the executive order is illegal. On May 21st, the judge down in Clay County was set to give his decision in that case. And what the Attorney General did was he said, we don't want a decision in that case. All right, we don't want the executive order to be found to be unlawful or enforceable. So we're going to say that no, because we're raising constitutional questions, we're going to remove all of these cases to federal court. So what the Attorney General essentially did, and that's the Illinois Attorney General, not the U.S. Attorney General. What the Illinois Attorney General there did was he essentially delayed the court from addressing many of the substantive issues because they thought that they weren't going to get the decision that they wanted down in Clay County. May 22nd, 2020, Attorney General Barr, who is the U.S. Attorney General, the Justice Department files a brief in support of Cabello and Bailey in federal court. So now the United States government has taken a position in Illinois saying that they believe that the executive order that Governor Pritzker issued is a violation of the First Amendment, not only freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, but also freedom of religion. The governor, however, kudos to him, on May 28th of 2020, facing just an enormous amount of pushback with respect to the closing of churches. He has the Illinois Department of Public Health issue quote unquote guidance for church services. And what they did is they're no longer saying that you cannot have ceremonies. They're no longer saying that you cannot have mass. What they're saying is that there are certain recommendations for these services that they want people to comply with. But if you don't comply with it, they've taken it out of the executive order. So essentially they've opened up many of the churches. So a lot of the points with respect to free exercise that are being considered in the federal court are now moot. And then on May 29th of 2020, that's the phase. So now the governor has changed from the executive order. So the executive order 32, which was the prior stay-at-home order, as well as the business closure order, that has lapsed. And now we're going into these phases. And so the governor issues his phase order, and we're starting in phase 3 throughout most of the state. He's segmented the state into various sections, and each section, based on the certain metrics that they're using, can either move forward or they can move back in terms of the phases. McHenry County is in the Chicagoland area, which I know a lot of the local representatives didn't like because the highest concentration of COVID cases are in Chicago, but we weren't able to be removed from that. Anyway, so we're all lumped in with Chicago. But anyway, things seem to be progressing regardless. So phase 3 of the order. Businesses and churches can reopen. The stay-at-home order is lifted, provided everybody comply with the social distancing, as well as the face mask requirements. Restaurants and places of amusement, so Six Flags, gyms, those all remain closed, but everything else can open up provided people are complying with the social distancing requirements. In order to get to so this is what's required for phase 4. Now in phase 4, essentially everything is opening back up. If you look sort of what's open, gatherings of 50 people or fewer are allowed at this time. Restaurants are going to be allowed to open back up, provided that they comply with certain measures to limit capacity. Personal care and health clubs, those are going to open back up. Entertainment, such as cinema and theaters, those are going to open back up. And all retail is also going to open back up as well. And what is required in order to get that is, and also the schools are going to open back up in phase 4. And this Friday, supposedly, McHenry County, the region that it's in, is going to be moving into phase 4. But what's required is we got to make sure that we have hospital capacity and that the testing is below 20% positivity rate, which means that less than 20% of the people that are tested are negative for COVID. And phase 5 is essentially everything opens back up. We all go back to normal and in order to get there, we essentially need a vaccine. All right. So let's talk about the executive orders as well as the Illinois Emergency Act. So the question is, okay, so the governor issues an executive order, and now who is going to enforce it? So for example, when somebody commits the offense of first-degree murder, there's a law. So there's a prohibition on first-degree murder, and if you commit this, then there is a penalty. All right. So anybody that knowingly kills somebody who knowingly killed somebody and is not justified in doing so is guilty of first-degree murder, and you face 20 to 60 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections. For the executive orders, we have a bunch of prohibitions. We have a bunch of things where the governor in the executive order has says you can't do it, but there's nothing that sets forth a penalty if you do it. All right. And so the question has always become, well, how exactly are these things supposed to be enforced? Well, let's start first of all with the Illinois Emergency Agency Act. So every emergency services and disaster agency established pursuant to this act. Okay, so what does that mean? So each county has their own emergency management administration. We have a really wonderful guy here. He's one guy. His name's David Christensen, and he's doing the best that he can to plan for and coordinate the emergency response of McHenry County. But they're saying that, okay, so these guys, these emergency service guys in each county, they need to execute and enforce the order. Okay, well, that's fine. But in a place like McHenry County, or also think about Clay County, that's a very small, that's the emergency management agency in McHenry County is an incredibly small number of people who are not equipped or trained to execute or enforce orders. And what does that even look like? So they go out to a restaurant that's open and they say, shut it down. And the person says, to Hades with you, man, I'm not shutting this place down. Well, so what are they supposed to do? Issue them a ticket? What does the ticket look like? And what is the penalty for having been given a ticket by the emergency management agency? That's not set forth anywhere in the act. All right. So this was a letter that Dave Christensen got on May 20th, which essentially said, so there's this growing chorus in Illinois, and there's a lot of pushback to the governor's order. And there were a number of emergency management agencies that were saying, look, Governor, we're not equipped to execute your orders. We don't even know what that looks like. We're not police. We don't investigate. We don't do police report. We don't do interviews. All of this would need to be done in order to establish that there's a violation. You keep telling us we need to enforce these things, but we have no capacity to do so. And so the governor, in response to those grievances, sends them a letter saying, if you don't enforce the order, we're going, with the federal funding that we get, that we direct towards your agencies, we're going to withhold that. And I know that that ruffled a lot of feathers. So the governor also has said, well, we also want the police to enforce this order. All right. And the problem with that is that, again, there's no criminal penalty for not complying with the executive order. There's no statute that says if you fail to comply with the governor's executive order that you face some kind of criminal penalty. It doesn't exist. So the police are supposed to do what? When they cite somebody with a crime, what the police generally have to do is identify the law that you violated and then charge you with a complaint for that. And that law that you violated has a built-in penalty. Again, doesn't exist for COVID. So what the Illinois State Police has said is, well, we want the police really to engage in community caretaking here. Now, police have multiple functions. One is to investigate crimes. Another is to protect people against those who would commit crimes. And then a third is a community caretaking function. And essentially what a community caretaking function is police officers are sort of expected to be model citizens within a community. And if Mrs. Robinson's cat runs up the tree, it's the police officer that can go get the tree. Or if you broke down on the side of the highway, the police officer, as part of his community caretaking function, will put his lights on while you change the tire just so other cars see you. So the police are just supposed to sort of look after other people and can engage other people for purposes of community caretaking. So what the Illinois State Police said is, well, we want you, pursuant to your community caretaking authority as well as your community caretaking power, to go out to people who are violating the executive orders and essentially have like a talk with them. Try to educate them on the purpose of the guidelines of Executive Order 8, and then try to direct that person to leave certain locations if they shouldn't be there, if they're out, or maybe they're in a group of more than 10. Maybe it's a kid's birthday party, return to his residence, whatever the case may be. But then the question is, okay, well, what if they tell you to go pound sand? What exactly do you do? What is your enforcement? And the Illinois State Police recommends that if somebody refuses that you charge them with reckless conduct. Okay, so let's look at what reckless conduct is. A person commits the offense of reckless conduct when he or she, by any means, or whether lawful or unlawful, recklessly performs an act that endangers the safety of another person. All right, and that's a Class A misdemeanor. So here's the question. So if a police officer made this arrest, we would have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So let's say you're in Clay County, where even today there's about 5 known cases of COVID, and you decide that your 11-year-old needs a birthday party. And so you get 15 kids together at your house. And so it's a violation of the 10-person, it's a violation of the order. There's 15 kids at your house, and the police show up and they try to direct you away, and you refuse. You say, no, it's 11 years old. He loves his friends. He needs to have this birthday party. I'm not doing anything, and you can't enforce this order. So a police officer charged that person with the Class A misdemeanor of reckless conduct. I need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the mother or the father who had the birthday party acted recklessly in having a birthday party for her 11-year-old and endangered the safety of another person. Can you really prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, especially if there's only 5 cases of COVID down in a place like Clay County? Can you really prove that anybody's life is in danger when we know that that virtually nobody under the age of 18 has died as a result of coronavirus? So, and can you see how many of the things that we talked about would come to play in that type of prosecution? So maybe they would get an epidemiologist to say that, no, I mean, by virtue of the fact that there's a small number of cases within this county, by virtue of the fact that children are generally not affected by COVID-19, I would say, in my professional opinion, that no, nobody was being endangered. All right. They can also force it through the Public Health Act, but again, and this would apply to restaurants. So if you're a restaurant, the Illinois Department of Public Health, just like if you had rodents, just like if you had roaches, just like if there was food poisoning, they can go and they can issue you a citation. But what they need to prove is that the public's health and welfare is significantly endangered by that restaurant being open. And when a lot of these factors about the death rates of COVID and how many people in particular areas have contracted it and what type of danger it actually poses to the people at that restaurant come into play, restaurant owners really can probably mount a very strong defense that what they're doing by being open does not significantly endanger the public. At least they could give us a run for their money. So really, when it comes to restaurants, how are they keeping these restaurants closed? I mean, you've heard a ton of restaurant owners in Illinois say, we're going to have to shut down here. And I got nothing to lose by opening up. And the governor's orders on whatever the case may be. There's been a number of people that have said, I'm just going to open up my restaurant. What has kept them shut so far? Why haven't you heard of a lot of restaurants opening? Because they send them cease and desist letters from the Illinois Liquor Control Commission saying that if you open up, we are going to revoke your liquor license, which for many restaurants is a significant part of their revenue. All right. So why is everybody suing the governor over his executive orders? Well, let's go back to the language in the Illinois Emergency Agency Act, all right? In the event of a disaster, the governor may, by proclamation, declare a disaster exists. Upon such period, this is the critical language, not to exceed 30 days. So the question is whether or not the governor can declare subsequent disaster declarations. So can the governor in perpetuity, every 30 days, based on his own discretion, just continue to declare disaster after disaster after disaster? Now, the Illinois Attorney General that's representing the governor in these things says, yes, absolutely he can, because there's nothing in the statute that expressly or explicitly limits his ability to do so. Well, the counter argument to that and the adverse position to that is, well, there's nothing in the statute that explicitly allows the governor to do so. And generally, when you're talking about giving out power, statutes are pretty clear in terms of expressing the power that they're given. And if it's not explicitly expressed, it's assumed not to exist. But what they also say, and what the Illinois Attorney General has also said in defending the governor is, hey, look, that's ridiculous, because unfortunately, when you're talking about something like COVID or a tornado or a flood, they don't always follow the 30-day legislative schedule. And so many of these disasters are lasting more than 30 days, and the governor needs to be able to respond to that. And so what me and others have pointed out is that while that's true, the statute should be interpreted to only allow the governor one 30-day period, because we really ultimately want, especially when we're talking about a disaster, and especially when we're trying to ensure that the incredible powers that a governor can wield during the course of a disaster are not abused, we really want the people's representatives making decisions about how we're going ultimately to respond to that disaster. So what we really want is the legislature ultimately charting the course here. All right. But the problem with just saying, well, then why have the governor be able to declare disaster at all? The problem is that when you're talking about a legislature, they're not very good at responding to disasters, because they need to haggle and negotiate, and everybody needs to talk and give speeches. And so that generally takes a long time. And so in an emergency situation where action is required immediately, sometimes drastic action, it makes sense for that power to repose within the executive. But the 30 days is enough time for the legislature to chart a course and to pass any legislation that they need in order to deal with COVID. So for example, in this case, had the governor declared the disaster on March 19th, the legislature then would have had 30 days until April 9th to come up with any legislation that it wanted in order to ensure that people stayed safe from COVID. And that very well may have been a stay-at-home order. It may have been a continuation of the stay-at-home order. It may have been a continuation of the business closure order. It may even have invested the governor with significant powers to continue to address on a day-to-day basis, but at least it would have been legitimate, and at least it wouldn't have just been the decision-making of one person. So now let's see, we got about 9 minutes left. So let me try to quickly get through the constitutional argument. So the other argument, okay, so against the executive orders was not just that the governor, by redeclaring the disaster, went beyond his authority. The other argument is that the executive orders were trenching or were violating people's rights. So this is what the First Amendment says: Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, abridging the freedom of speech or the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble. So what many people say is that, look, these executive orders are prohibiting my free exercise of speech, as well as my free exercise to assemble, as well as religion. So with respect to speech and assembly, essentially what they're saying is, look, we cannot go out in the form of a protest because of these stay-at-home orders to petition our government with respect to any number of issues that we may want. We can't go protest. We can't assemble to talk about these issues. These are violating our rights. And then and then many of the people who argued that this was a violation of their free exercise of religion said, look, you're keeping us home. We can't go to church to celebrate the mass. We can't go to a synagogue. We can't go to the mosque. We can't go wherever. And that's a violation of our First Amendment right to practice our religion. Okay, so the first thing sort of to note, well, let me go back. The first thing to note about constitutional rights is that they're not absolute. And everybody sort of inherently recognizes this when people say, well, you can't yell fire in a movie theater. And that's true, but it kind of the analysis becomes a little bit trickier when we're talking about a legitimate interest in abbreviating a constitutional right, such as COVID. So how do you balance public safety versus people's constitutional rights? So for example, if you want to protest, that's fine. But even right now, you can't come into my office and protest against something that the state's attorney's office is doing. You can't come into a government building necessarily and protest what the state's attorney's office. If you want to practice your religion, that's fine, but you can't hold mass in a crowded neighborhood at 2 o'clock in the morning every single Sunday. So reasonable restrictions can be placed on the manner and the time, as well as the place that you're exercising your constitutional rights. These are called, quote unquote, time, manner, and place restrictions. All right. So if all the government is doing is limiting sort of the time, the manner, and the place in which you are exercising your rights, all that the government needs to establish is that, look, is that the prohibitions are reasonable. All right. The harder question is not time, place, and manner restrictions. The harder question is when it appears as though the government is discriminating against certain type of speech. So, for example, if the city of Crystal Lake passed an ordinance that says that nobody can protest against lower taxes within Crystal Lake, but you can protest with respect to anything else, it would appear as though they are. It would appear as though that's a quote unquote content restriction. All right. So it appears as though the government is trying to regulate not the time, manner, and place in which you can get your message out, but they're trying to regulate the content of what you're saying. All right. So another example would be if instead of saying that nobody can hand out pamphlets at the airport said nobody can hand out pamphlets that is wearing a Hare Krishna dress at the airport. They would seem to be discriminating against a specific religion. And when you do that, when you're discriminating against a religion or when you're trying to regulate the content of speech, then it's not just whether or not that regulation is reasonable. Now you have to pass strict scrutiny. So if it appears as though government regulation speech is content-based or that the regulation targets or discriminates against the religion, the law can still be upheld if the regulation advances a compelling government interest and is narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. So the government needs to establish that their regulation advances a compelling interest. So in the case of COVID, does the government have a compelling interest? I would say yes. They have a compelling interest in trying to save people's life and preventing a public health emergency. Subsequent question is, okay, is it narrowly tailored to achieve that interest? And what that means is the state action using the least restrictive means? All right. So this is what the Supreme, well, before I get to what the Supreme Court said, let me say this. So is it using the least restrictive means? So now when we're talking about COVID, there's two questions. One, is this executive order a time, place, and manner restriction, or does it appear as though the government is discriminating against certain viewpoints? Now, the Illinois Attorney General, and this went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court quickly, and they issued a real short 3-page opinion just because it was a small legal issue. But what the United States Supreme Court said is, no. This is that we don't need to apply strict scrutiny in this case because this is only a time, place, and manner restriction. It does not appear as though the government has a preference for certain type of speech. Rather, all types of assembly and all types of protests are banned. So it's not as though they're picking and choosing and saying that people that are protesting against the executive order, you can't protest, but other people can. With respect to religion, they're also pointing that out. Look, we're not banning a specific religion, and we're not even favoring a specific religion over secular activities. Rather, all that we're doing in this case is we're banning large groups and large assemblies. So in addition to banning religion, we're also banning going to the movie theater, going to concerts, things of that nature, which shows that the government does not have a discriminatory purpose against religion. And as a result of that, we're not going to apply strict scrutiny. Rather, the real question is whether or not these restrictions are reasonable. And based on the threat that is posed, the courts have found so far that these executive orders are reasonable. So that is a very quick and dirty run through of many of the constitutional arguments, as well as many of the legal and statutory issues and some of the headwinds that the governor's executive orders have faced. So thank you all very much for your attention. Does anybody have any questions or anything else that, or any comments that they want to bring up?
Thanks, Patrick. This is Jennifer Prell. My question is, how can the governor withhold federal money to a local emergency management when it's federal money, not local state money?
Because the federal money is given to the state for distribution. So the state gets all kinds of federal money, and then they set up all kinds of grants, and you need to do applications. And the federal law says, we're giving you this money with the understanding that you're going to make decisions as to how that money is dispersed.
Okay. Thank you. I don't see any more questions yet. Anybody else have any questions? I don't see any. Well, thank you so much. I loved this presentation.
Oh, thank you. That's nice of you to say.
Thank you. I did. I really enjoyed it. I learned tons, which makes me very happy. So I will be posting this on ElderWorks YouTube page as well for viewing later. And it is also going to be on Facebook. We did Facebook Live today, first time ever. So hopefully everything went well.
Great.
So thank you so much. You guys have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everybody.
Yep. Bye-bye, guys.